Julian. Welcome to the Monday morning introduction to philosophy and theory live stream lecture. Today we are going to be continuing the lecture series on the concept of subjective destitution with a special emphasis on Slavoj Žižek's concept of what he calls the Christian Sublime. This is going to be a 30-minute introductory session in which I explain to you step by step what Žižek means by the Christian Sublime. Along the way, we're also going to learn about the Kantian sublime, and specifically how he contrasts the dynamic with the mathematical sublime. If you're curious about this idea, Slavoj Žižek actually elaborates it in his book Tarrying with the Negative, Kant, Hegel, and the Critique of Ideology, which was published by Duke Press. If you'd like to read the passages in question, which are fairly dense, please go to page, I believe, 50. Page 50, the Christian Sublime or the Downward Synthesis. First of all, hello and welcome to everybody joining us from around the world. Greetings to our patrons and subscribers. Hello to Romania. Hello to Albania. It is wonderful to see you here this morning. If you'd like to support this channel, and if you'd like to download the complete guide to Žižek ebook series volumes 1 through 8, please consider checking out my Patreon, where you can find my ebooks as well as the audio downloads for each and every lecture, plus edited transcripts, as well as a weekly bonus seminar that I record live on Discord after each and every live stream lecture. The Discord is especially fun because I sort of get to exchange ideas with you guys, which is always very enjoyable for me. Okay, let's jump right in. Today we're going to be talking about the Christian Sublime, which is a concept that Žižek has elaborated in several of his books that relates to the idea of Christian atheism, but today I would like to specifically approach it from the perspective of subjective destitution. After all, subjective destitution is the theme of this ongoing lecture series. You can see the previous lectures in my playlist. Subjective destitution is a Lacanian concept, which is also supposed to be the aim of psychoanalysis. It is the emptying out of the subject, the getting rid of or traversing the fundamental fantasy, the precious core, the kernel, the treasure, the secret agalma, the idea that the subject is a true, authentic subject, and so on, etc. We've covered this in previous lectures. However, perhaps the ultimate example of subjective destitution occurs within the New Testament. After all, on the cross, Christ on the cross is the figure of subjective destitution, by which it is not man who traverses the fundamental fantasy, but in fact God himself. This is essentially one of Žižek's arguments, to simplify somewhat, that the crucifixion represents the process by which the gap between man and God is transposed back into man himself. In other words, the inaccessible noumenal realm of the high and mighty deity, the Father in the sky, is the fundamental fantasy which is traversed in the moment of the crucifixion. In other words, the crucifixion represents in theological form a kind of subjective destitution by which God himself has to die so that man might live or be resurrected. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here, so let's take this step by step. After all, I think this is deserving of some closer inspection. We're going to be talking about the Christian Sublime and its unique characteristics. And in order to understand what we mean by the Christian Sublime, it can be really quite helpful to think about and define the word sublime. So let's begin with the Burkean category of the sublime and then move into the Kantian categories of the sublime. After all, Burke was a key influence for Kant's work. So if any of you have taken an art history class, then you've probably already encountered the concept of the Burkean sublime. For Burke, the sublime was essentially contrasted with the beautiful, and yet there was always something beautiful within the sublime. Think about a raging storm. Think about something which overwhelms us in its all-powerful sense. This romantic motif of man made minuscule in front of a raging storm or in front of a mountainous view is essentially an artistic rendition of the Burkean sublime. Burke's central argument was that when we were confronted with something that was so much bigger than ourselves, that made us feel infinitesimally small, in which we disappeared, we were essentially confronted with the manifestation of God. In other words, God, in his omnipotence, in his unknowing and silent quality, was nevertheless made manifest in these spectacles of nature, as it were, a raging storm, or thunder and lightning, etc. We have here already a kernel, I think, of the pagan logic that the gods are inscrutable and unknowable, but we can see their anger in the skies. And yet, for Burke, a storm wasn't a direct manifestation of a godly distemper, but instead, in its formal structure, a representation of the unknown. Namely, it is when we are confronted with the chaotic beauty of nature that we are confronted with the form of God. Now, Burke contrasted this with what he called the beautiful. And for Burke, the beautiful, thereby being the phenomenal, namely that which appears to us as beautiful, was a lesser form of the sublime. Call it the trickle-down theory of the sublime. When we confronted something which was beautiful, what appealed to us was its form. Therefore, its form was something which represented an ideal. This could be either the ideal of feminine beauty, or perhaps the ideal of a musical or architectural form. This actually goes back to theories of antiquity, of ancient and Greek philosophy, in the pursuit of the ideal reflections of a form that manifested a godly or divine ideal. However, Kant problematizes and complicates Burke's theory. He goes quite a bit further in essentially creating a philosophy of the sublime or a teleology of the sublime. Kant begins, and this is quite important to understand, Kant begins by distinguishing between two forms of the sublime, namely the mathematical sublime and the dynamic sublime. And to put it somewhat simply, the mathematical sublime is when we are confronted with something knowable and yet which completely exceeds our grasp. For example, if we contemplate the infinite or near infinite nature of the universe, something which we can theorize about, something which in principle we can prove or determine, and yet which fundamentally exceeds our cognitive capacities, at least on an individual level. The reason that this is called the mathematical sublime is that mathematics is what allows us to stretch the very limits or boundaries of our conceptual reason. We can prove something by means of mathematical formulae and therefore hold them in our head, as it were, for a moment, and yet we can't really think them or conceive of them. And even on a very basic level, what a number or a mathematical formula therefore does is it acts as a stand-in, as a placeholder for the conceptualization of something that exceeds the immediate grasp of phenomena as they appear to us. Even on a very basic level, for example, this is where the mathematical sublime exposes common sense in its limited form. For example, a flat earth theorist might go poke his head out the door and say, well, the earth looks pretty flat to me. Here we have the limits of sense perception, as already understood by Kant. Whereas the mathematical sublime is what we are able to see, or determine, or think, that goes beyond our immediate sense perception, precisely because we have the use of mathematical formula. Now, you can see that there's an element of the sublime in this, of course, which is to say, if the sublime is that which confronts us with something which is unknowable, then the mathematical sublime confronts us with something which we can deduce, which we can create formulae for, and which we can deduct and have evidence for, and yet fundamentally we can't really see it, or perhaps even really know it or grasp it. It remains outside of our reach. This means that, strictly speaking, the mathematical sublime is on the level of the universal noumenon, which is to say, it is out there, but we can't fully grasp it. We can have ways of ascertaining it or formalizing it through mathematical formula, through phenomena, as it were, and yet these are mere representations of something which cannot be fully thought. To simplify somewhat for a moment, if you've ever encountered the argument that perhaps there are ideas that we cannot think because our brains are simply too limited for them, like how a dog might not be able to do calculus, here we have essentially the mathematical sublime, something which represents the outer boundaries of our own cognitive capacities. We can scratch at its surface, but we can't fully grasp it or think it, like the infinite nature of anything. Now, this is contrasted by Kant with the idea of the dynamic sublime. And the dynamic sublime is essentially something which can be grasped quite easily, which can be conceptualized really in a very straightforward way, and which nevertheless can't be properly given substantive form. For example, the idea of God or an immortal soul, perhaps even the idea of karma or luck. These are essentially concepts that we have that help us navigate the world, especially when something happens that doesn't conform to our immediate sense perception, i.e., we can't make sense of it. And yet, strictly speaking, they aren't something that we could prove, certainly not by means of mathematical formulae, and yet we hold on to them as if they were real. Once again, you can see here that there's an element of the sublime. If the sublime is the ideal unknowable form, which is represented to us in something which defies or transcends representation, like for Burke, the beautiful, romantic, chaotic violence of nature, then the idea of God or an immortal soul is precisely this dynamic sublime. We feel it to be true, perhaps some of us claim to know that it is true, and yet strictly speaking, we cannot find proof or evidence for it. Hence, to once again simplify, Kant essentially says that we have the mathematical sublime and the dynamic sublime. The mathematical sublime is when we are overwhelmed with something which transcends or exceeds the very boundaries of our intellectual categories. The dynamic sublime is something that overwhelms us, for which we have no reasonable explanation, and to which we therefore lend conceptual categories such as God or soul or luck or karma, etc. Now, it's important to note here, to take a step back for a moment, that Kant is interested in the critique of pure reason, right? This is in the critique of pure reason, Kant is essentially trying to ascertain how we might reach a pure form, a noumenal category that can be thought without being tarnished a priori or from within by conceptual categories of reason. And in a sense, Kant is the first God killer, as it were. As soon as Kant declares that the things in themselves cannot be known or thought, he has declared the death of God, as it were. He has declared the death of a kind of metaphysical holy grail, a noumenal entity which is purely so. And yet, the Kantian cop-out is that he says, well, it's precisely because we can't think it that it remains nevertheless pure. It's precisely because it is phenomenally inaccessible to us that it remains ideal, as it were. In fact, Žižek has quite a nice line about this on page 55 of Tarrying with the Negative, where he says, the status of the disputed object therefore differs radically. The universe as a whole is the totality of phenomena, whereas God or soul are noumenal entities beyond phenomena. Consequently, the solution of the antinomies is also different in each of the two cases. In the first case, both the thesis and the antithesis are false, since the very object to which the thesis attributes finitude and the antithesis infinitude does not exist. Now, that is a very complicated passage, but Žižek has a really simple idea that he's trying to lay out here, which is to say, the mathematical and the dynamic sublime correspond to the Kantian antinomies, which is to say, Kant is the first to properly teleologize the Burkean sublime. The Burkean distinction between the universal, namely the sublime, and the phenomenal, the beautiful, is essentially problematized by Kant in the dynamic and the mathematical sublime, which is to say, we can draw a connection between the Kantian sublime and the theory of antinomy. In the same way that we have the dynamic sublime and the mathematical sublime, we have the mathematical antinomy and the dynamic antinomy. The mathematical antinomy is to uphold the idea of the existence of a non-knowable, non-traversable horizon of reason, a non-phenomenal identity, pure form, essence. Whereas the dynamic sublime, or the dynamic antinomy, is the suggestion that the only way in which we access this concept of pure reason in the first place is itself through a conceptual category of impotence, of impossibility. Namely, it is our very impossibility of knowing or traversing the transcendental horizon that retroactively brings about its appearance. Hence, in the Kantian antinomy of the mathematical and dynamic sublime, we have already in its infancy the Hegelian metaphysical insight, namely that essence is appearance qua appearance. Essence, the noumenal, non-phenomenal form, only appears within the failure of the phenomena to transcend themselves. Here we have essentially what Žižek characterizes as the downward synthesis of Hegelian dialectics. Or to put it somewhat more simply, the Kantian dialectic never, if there is such a thing, the Kantian metaphysics is essentially an upward synthesis. The idea is that the phenomena are representations of a lesser form of the ideal. And the goal, therefore, is to reunite the lowly category of the phenomena with the higher categories of the ideal. The sublime is the point of failure by which these two remain ineffably detached. The Hegelian sublime, on the other hand, is precisely the sublime of the dialectic by which essence only appears as essence by means of the very failure of the phenomena to transcend or overcome this gap, what Žižek characterizes as tarrying with the negative. Now, this is a lot of conceptual jargon that we've introduced, but it's actually quite important if you want to understand Žižek's argument about the Christian sublime. I've already given you a hint of sorts, which is to say that the Christian sublime is also the Hegelian sublime. It is essentially the dialectical sublime, the sublime, if you will, of a double kenosis, of an emptying out, which is also a filling in, or, to put it in Lacanian terms, of subjective destitution. So let us take a tiny little breath so that we can now make our way to the second part of this argument, namely that of the Christian sublime. So Žižek's argument, in its most simple form, can be put like this. Traditional, by which I mean pagan or Judaic faiths, uphold the idea that God is an unknowable, transcendental, inscrutable deity, or the gods from a pagan perspective. That therefore the role of man is essentially to appease the gods or the god, to live in accordance with his or their rules or mores. Therefore we have a simple, if you will, field of morality. To be good is to act in accordance with the eternal laws of the deity, and to be bad or evil is to exist essentially in a way that is contradictory to the eternal good of the deity. Now, the Kantian, as I said, God-killing insight of the unknowable, noumenal realm, the thing in itself, therefore already problematizes this relationship between the good and the bad, or the good and the evil. Which is to say, if we can't know the ideal, as Kant states, then strictly speaking, we can't rely upon a category of good and evil that is fully knowable to us. In other words, Kant plants a seed of doubt in our minds, which is to say, is the good really good? Or is it simply something that we must assume is good because we cannot know? And the beautiful, to simplify somewhat, the beautiful Kantian solution is that the good is therefore simply that which we collectively do so that it might, through our very interaction, resemble what ought to be the ideal or divine good. Which is to say, the good is when we try to ascertain what the good might look like, and in collectively so doing, we achieve it. However, the more radical implication of this is that, strictly speaking, the unknowable moral ethical quality of the divine is the very face of evil, namely unknowable to us, the dark side of the moon. Or, if you will, it is the good which lacks in its transcendentance, quality, the ability of us to know it, thereby not creating the ethical domain by which we might try to ascertain it, therefore revealing itself in its opposite form, namely as evil. That is a really difficult thing to understand. So let me try to say it one more time, perhaps even more clearly, or less densely. If the good is doing that which we must, because we cannot know what the good is, then any good which would be lacking this inscrutable quality, namely a good which could be known a priori, would itself be evil, since it would not have the foundations upon which such a constructive good might be placed. Hence, Kant essentially achieves this radical inversion by which the idea of a pure noumenal ethical realm of the good would itself be evil, because it wouldn't grant us the properly subjective ethical realm on which and through which we might achieve a common collective good. Here we have, in its primary form, already the Hegelian argument apropos the Christian Sublime. When Hegel argues that what dies on the cross is not the God of the beyond, when Hegel argues that what dies on the cross is not simply the body of Christ, but instead the God of the beyond, Hegel is arguing that what takes place in the New Testament is a logical transition from a transcendental theology, which is to say, lowly man who must ascertain what God wants from him so as to appease him and someday be reunited with him, towards a complete inversion or desublimation, if you will, of this logic, by which it is God himself who must fall so as to rise again amongst men. Hence, to go back to Kant, the ethical quality of the New Testament, in its philosophical logic, is that the ideal isn't simply out there in the transcendental beyond, but instead must be materialized, must be subjectivized through a constitutive failure to be realized, which of course is, for Hegel, the event of the cross. After all, what is the event of the cross if not a constitutive failure of God to present himself as an omnipotent being or deity? In other words, after the New Testament, it becomes strictly speaking impossible, or at least illogical, to see God and Christ as simply a role model to be followed, someone in whose footsteps one should tread. Instead, the properly radical dimension of the New Testament is that this very model of transcendental worship, live so that you might live in accordance with the good, is itself radically undermined and presents itself as a kind of evil. After the New Testament, to believe in the idea of an omnipotent deity and to simply want to worship and appease him as if he were some pagan overlord presents itself, at least through the ethical lens of Kant, Hegel, and Žižek, as a kind of evil, as it distorts and refuses to recognize the proper ontological consequences of the crucifixion, which that after the crucifixion, it is the collective unity of man that must stage the resurrection of Christ in and through its collective identity, its acts and works, or what some people refer to as the Trinity. In this precise sense, Žižek likes to point towards the monstrosity of Christ. The monstrosity of Christ is precisely that he appears all too human, impotent, just like us. He is not the Savior who tells us the truth. He is not the figure who shows us the noumenal realm, who reunites us with the fatherly God. Instead, he is the traumatic and indeed traumatized subject who represents us with the non-traversable horizon of noumenal appearance of the ideal. Kant as the, Freudian slip. Christ as the Kantian representative of the unknowable quality of the thing in itself. It is in and through Christ that we must give up our hopes of reunification on a transcendental level And yet this creates the opening by which this reunification has already occurred in and through the body of Christ, which is then reified, to adopt a Marxist term for a moment, in and through the community of the faithful. This is what Žižek calls the Christian Sublime. The Christian Sublime, therefore, in its relationship to the mathematical and dynamic sublime, works like this. If, or to go all the way back to Burke, if for Burke, the sublime is when we are confronted with the chaotic transcendental beauty of a raging storm, small man faced with the unknowable spectral quality of the godly realm, then in the Kantian transition to the mathematical sublime, we already have the antinomy implicit within the sublime as such, which is to say the antinomy between the universal and the particular, between the noumenon and the phenomenon, between that which can only be conceptualized and that which can be proven, but perhaps more importantly, how the very relationship between concept and reason is already intertwined. Think again about the mathematical formulae. We use mathematics to conceptualize something which exceeds or transcends our reason. Hence, empirical reason allows us to briefly comprehend something which exceeds the boundaries of our knowledge, of our brains, as it were, and yet symbolizes it into a formula that if we were to calculate it would give us the illusion, not the illusion, but the image, if you will, in our heads of the infinite, of something which we cannot see, but which we can only think. Therefore, in mathematical formula, we have the appearance of the sublime, of the noumenal category, in the phenomena of its impossibility, namely the representation of that which cannot be represented. After all, what is a mathematical formula, if not the representation of the unrepresentable? In other words, Kant transposes the idea of the Burkean raging storm onto the idea of the mathematical formula. The dynamic sublime accomplishes something different, namely the same thing but in reverse. The dynamic sublime is when we are confronted with something which overwhelms us that we cannot give a name or a concept to. There is no mathematical formula to explain it. And so we lend to it the words God or eternal soul. Hence, these are concepts that represent the ideal, but only because we are confronted with the boundaries of the knowable within phenomenal experience as such. In both cases, the subject is entirely irreducible to the conceptualization of the ideal. In fact, one might even go as far as saying that the Kantian idea in its infancy is that the subject is the very site for the sublime, what you might call a subjective sublime, that the subject is the staging ground for this clashing of impossibilities between the phenomenal and the noumenal, the subject as void of appearance, as Hegel might say. Added to this is the Žižekian category of the Christian sublime, which is really the Hegelian dialectical sublime cast in another form. The simplest way to explain the Christian sublime is that it is the logical inversion that occurs in his reading of the New Testament, by which we transcend the transcendental logic, namely lowly man and highly God, into the desublimation of God. The gap between man and God is transposed back into man himself, namely through and by the Trinity, for which Christ is the vanishing mediator. The quote-unquote impotence of Christ, the fact that he is a mere man, that from the perspective of someone who believes in a transcendental representative of the divine, he appears to be monstrous, namely monstrously inadequate. This quality of Christ is precisely what allows him not to raise us up to God, but in a sense to bring God back down to us. Hence, the resurrection isn't simply the process by which Christ gets into a transcendental elevator that brings him back up into heaven, like a Super Mario who gets to try again. Instead, the image of the resurrection is already completed, already takes place precisely within the desublimation of God into man. What appears as a regression is in fact an ascent. It is a dialectical movement of the highest and the lowest. This is what Hegel would call the dialectical sublime, or what Žižek dubs thereby the Christian sublime. In other words, it inverts the central mechanism. From a Burkean perspective, the sublime is when small man is confronted with big God. The Kantian sublime is when the very categories of small and big become impossibly intertwined through phenomenal antinomies of conceptual reason, mathematical and dynamic. The Hegelian dialectical sublime completes this inversion by suggesting that it is not lowly man and highly God, but it is God himself who must become small so as to be made great in and through man. In other words, we have a rotation that occurs between the Burkean sublime, the Kantian sublime, and the Hegelian Christian sublime. A inversion which also represents, therefore, a teleological one, and thereby an ontological one. Namely, the teleological argument for Burke is that the sublime represents that to which we must aspire. For Kant, the idea is that the sublime represents that which torments us, which confronts us with our impotence. Whereas for Hegel, the sublime is the very category of self-reflective negation, of the immanent unfolding of spirit or reason as such. Hence, Hegel essentially positivizes the sublime in the opposite form of the Burkean sublime. The Burkean sublime must find its antithesis in the Kantian sublime so as to achieve its synthesis in the Hegelian Christian sublime, as it were. Now, this has been a lot for half an hour, but hopefully it's given you the elementary framework of what Žižek calls the Christian sublime. I will continue this discussion in next week's lecture, but for now, thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next week. If you'd like to learn more about Žižek and my take on Žižek, please consider downloading the Complete Guide to Žižek ebook series on Patreon, or if you'd simply like to support this channel, please consider becoming a patron. For $5, you can access a Discord channel or server or whatever it's called, plus a weekly seminar that I host after every lecture. In fact, we will be beginning said seminar in about 5 minutes or so. Thank you so much for being here today. I will see you tomorrow.